right.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Real Talk with Shan and Bilal. I feel like the emotions are already fired up, so let's just get right into it. We're going to be talking about gun control
First up,
in light of the recent shooting in Florida. So, Sean, I'm going to be honest. I really don't think the current Second Amendment is up to the current needs of the nation. I think we need to replace the wording of it. We need to rewrite it completely in a way that provides weapons only to those in the police force, which would be the new well-regulated militia. We were talking about this in governmental politics, but the Federalist Papers kind of say that the right to bear arms is needed, so in case the government becomes tyrannical, then it should be used to overthrow the government. At the same time, I still think that in the modern day, that's kind of bullshit. If you want to show your concern with the government, you can protest. That regardless, if the government becomes tyrannical, then at that point, you've already lost. So, Sean, do you have anything to say about the shooting that happened? How many kids need to die? That's my thing.
Well, yeah. First of all, thoughts and prayers to the families of the children that died yesterday. I think it's like 17 at this point that have been killed. Many
it was in Parkland, Florida?
Yeah, Parkland in Florida. Yeah, so it was obviously a terrible shooting. Not much has to be said about how many of these have occurred in America over the past God knows how many years at this point, and it's only getting worse in terms of the availability of these AR-15s and these high ammunition firearms to the people who obviously do not either need it or do not have the mental capacity to carry it. So there has to be definitely regulations in order to prevent these people from buying guns. Now, from a conservative point of view, I definitely understand people on the right side of the aisle saying that banning guns or having heavily regulating the usage of these guns is not viable in the long term, especially for a country like America where the NRA pretty much has monopolized the gun market and the gun lobby as a whole. I mean, there's no kind of opposition to the NRA. If you see, there's a lot of interest groups who, not only just the NRA, but who support the NRA, who lobby to Congress in order to not only monetarily, but just in general, lobby to Congress in order to prevent legislation that would limit guns, because all they have to say is no to everything. It's basically what I guess the Arab world has been saying to Israel in terms of recognition. It's the same thing here. All you have to do is just say no to every one of their proposals and then go home. That's the end of the day. That's basically what the gun lobby has become in the NRA is basically the big wigs that monetarily pay the people in order to prevent these legislations from passing.
But the thing is, let's go back to the shooting that was in Las Vegas, right, with the bump stock.
Yeah.
So even something that should be so obvious, right, such as getting rid of the bump stock, which basically turned any semi-automatic firearm fully automatic, and that seems like a no-brainer, right? It's like you did not, if you want to file for a fully automatic military-grade rifle, then there's a separate filing for that, and then there's one for semi-automatic, and then so goes the list, right? But if you have a means to basically just jump the gun, sorry for the pun,
Good stuff. Okay.
just completely change what it is, then at that point, that should be banned because you're kind of going around the entire system. That in and of itself is a loophole. So there's so many different loopholes that need to be fixed. The biggest one being the gun show loophole. So I've actually never been to a gun show. Have you been to a gun show? I've seen videos of them. And
yeah,
they look ridiculous. It's like something you should see in the Khyber Pass in Pakistan. They'll just have racks and racks of guns. People just standing in front of them, obviously from their gun shop or privately owned, whatever it might be. And then people, without really having to file a substantial amount of paperwork, save for a receipt that the gun seller might want, they can just get a gun. And then they can just go on with their lives. They don't need to inform the federal government that they are now in possession of this. So I find that to be ridiculous. So in terms of the gun show loophole, do you think there's any hope in saving, or not saving, in fixing that?
Well, as far as the gun show loophole goes, I think it's a very big loophole to close, and it's going to take a long time in order to close in the first place. And what a lot of conservatives have, the reservations that a lot of conservatives have in the gun issue, as well as the gun loophole, is that many people on the left side of the aisle, whether you say journalists or people in general who have experimented to expose the gun show loophole, for the most part, if you see even people on MSNBC, ABC, they've tried to get guns as easily as possible from the gun shows, and it's not as readily available as the media makes it out to be. So that's why a lot of people on the right side of the aisle believe that, it's kind of a hoax to believe that it's that readily available. You need to go through a certain degree of background checks depending on your background, depending on your mental state, all that kind of stuff. I think you can't buy a gun if you have certain mental conditions, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, the loophole has been made very broad because obviously you can't regulate all gun shows at the same degree.
That's true.
So that's why at that point it becomes very difficult. And in addition to that, what a bunch of people on the left have been calling on for is for outright bans on certain guns. And like AR-15s, AK-47s, and stuff like that. Stuff that only the people in the military and the police force should possess.
Fully automatic ones.
Fully automatic weapons, yeah. And what a lot of people have been saying is that in a country like the U.S. where guns are so abundantly available, I mean, each person in the U.S. can, I think, statistically own like 3 guns or 2 guns apiece. Every person in the U.S., something like that. And what that basically means is if you regulate guns at any degree, there will be people...
They will be pissed.
Yeah, pissed. And there will be criminals who will continue to hold guns because obviously the law didn't apply to them before, the law doesn't apply to them now. In fact, what it basically does, banning certain guns, is that it creates a price floor in terms of economics, because then the price of these guns are going to skyrocket when the supply decreases. The demand is going to stay relatively the same, but when the supply decreases, you're going to have an extremely high price range that you're going to have to work with, and that's what influences black markets to increase their production.
So you think even with a ban, let's use handguns, because handguns always the one that's thrown out. So let's say we had a ban on handguns currently implemented in our town. Obviously, you don't want to say it because. Okay, so let's say our town just banned handguns, right?
Yeah.
Outside forces, right, would they would make the guns. They would be able to come into South Brunswick and sell them at a high rate. Is that basically what you're saying? I agree with that because that's basically what's happening in Chicago. You'll have firearms coming from all around the state.
Yeah, Chicago, Baltimore.
Country.
Yeah.
Yeah, the high crime areas.
Exactly.
And so there's the economic incentive to have that. But if you see the thing, then you have to talk about the fact that there are already so many guns in the United States.
Exactly.
You'd have what the government would have to do hypothetically would be to ban the class of firearms, and then have over the course of the next 5 years or a decade, have law enforcement actively seek out those guns and retrieve them.
Yeah, exactly. From the black markets, especially where these guns are going to be the most readily available at a higher price, obviously, but more readily available in places where the most stringent of gun laws and regulations are implemented, such as you said, Chicago and Baltimore. And what a lot of liberals I see, a lot of people on the left, bring up this false comparison between the U.S. and Australia, because Australia, after their first and only at this point mass shooting that occurred, I think back in the 90s.
I think it was early 2000s, but yeah, same thing.
Back then, and then I think they had a permanent ban on certain
they just
weapons.
Over the course of a year or something, they basically said, if we know you have a gun, we're coming for your gun, and they just took them in.
Yeah, and now it's gotten a little less stringent. They allow certain people with guns if you have certain government-approved licenses, but at the same time, it
was an emotional law.
Really, exactly, it's very emotional. And to their credit, yes, they have not had a mass shooting since that one. But at the same time, you can't compare Australia to the U.S., obviously. Population.
It's not about... People always say the population... I'm just coming from a liberal, obviously, but liberals always tend to bring up the population argument when it comes to Australia. I think the better argument would be the gun culture.
Yeah, and the culture especially.
It's so intense in the United States. It's to the point of fetishizing. They've created a fetish. How about that?
Yeah.
Around firearms, right?
Because for us, it's a symbol of freedom. It's a symbol of breaking the shackles of oppression, starting with the British. That's how we defeated them. That's what our idea of defeating the British in the Revolutionary War was, and it's come generationally ever since. It's going to be very hard to break.
You have a line all the way back to the founding fathers, who literally are the ones that wrote the words of a well-regulated militia of the right to bear arms, right?
Yeah.
So I get that. People feel that connection to the founding of America, to American democracy, by having the right to bear arms, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a certain degree of respect you should have for the ability of America to change. So the founding fathers, in their wisdom, at the time they needed to create the Second Amendment in case the United States government became tyrannical. In their wisdom, they said the government should have the ability to change. The Constitution should have the ability to change. So I'm not talking even about, replacing the what was it? Repealing altogether and only the Second Amendment, right? I'm talking about how like after the election of 1800, right, they had to rewrite like parts of the presidential area. I was it like Article 2 or something of the Constitution, right? So like first and second place, that's not going to cut it anymore. You have a separate election for the president, second for the vice president. And they still had the general idea, right, of the electoral college, of the presidency, but they reworked it to fit the needs of the country. And we didn't have, and so at that time, right, you were able to change it because of the dire situation it put ourselves in. The government of like Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, they just hated each other. So it damaged the executive branch, right? So now, with the creation of these fully automatic, even semi-automatic, I don't think people should have, all of these firearms, right? Once again, this threat to America has arrived, right? So that's the one reason I think you should rewrite it so that people, if they're authorized by the state and if this local government, right, has the ability to look after them, then you should allow them, right? So if they're part of the well-regulated militia, which should be like the police force, or if the police force of that area specifically knows they have the gun, then you should have it. It should be three-tiered. Usually there's like state, you have to like register with the state, then you have to register with the federal government. I think it should also go down to the local government, because the local government, if they know you have a gun, right, they're going to be able to keep a closer eye on you. They're going to be able to see what you're doing. So if they feel you need to get some mental health, or if they feel you might do something with your firearm, then they can fix, or then they can go after you specifically.
And you brought up a really good point about mental health. We always talk about the way to prevent gun violence is to kind of fund mental health initiatives in this country even more. But the problem with that, obviously, is politicians don't want to do that because that's not going to stack their pockets up. I mean, what lobby group will lobby politicians in order to spend more money for mental health facilities? It costs a lot of money, obviously. You can't determine who has what definitive mental health issues, and you can't even determine whether or not they have been rehabilitated effectively to the point where they can possibly own a gun. I mean, so it's very subjective at that point to implement any mental health regulations or laws, or like implement any sort of clause that donates money, I guess.
I mean, when you're talking about lobbyists, right? I mean, the NRA has the Republicans by the balls the same way that like healthcare companies or health insurance companies have the Democrats by the balls, right? They say that they're in favor of it. They say that they're in favor, like for Republicans, that they're in favor of gun control, but the NRA obviously comes into play.
Yeah.
Democrats say, oh yeah, of course we're in favor of expanding Obamacare, making it a one-payer system. Or a single-payer system. But then the health insurance companies say, no, we still need to have a role in this.
Yeah.
So
I will say one thing though. If you compare the U.S. and Australia in terms of their crime rates, the crime rate in the U.S. is higher by a little less than 9% than Australia overall.
9?
Yeah, because they're at like 55.84, which is ranked 30th, and then Australia is at 46.01, which is ranked 47th in the world. But if you look at the change in crime rate percentages from year to year, at least for the last 5 years, Australia's has steeply increased over the past 5 years, while the U.S. has remained pretty much stagnant, which suggests that in the U.S. gun violence accounts for chunks of overall crime in this country, overall violent crime, whereas in Australia, it's more of an overall trend that is increasing, not just in the sense of gun violence, because obviously they've regulated that to a point where it's not that much of an issue there anymore, but there are other sources of extreme violent crime in Australia, whereas the U.S. has that mostly under control, and that's another argument that people on the right use.
Just out of curiosity, there's a recent uptick, right, as you said, in the Australian crime rate. Can you look up another graph as to when Australia started deregulating firearms? Because if you were able to make a direct correlation between the rise in violent crime and the deregulation of firearms within Australia, then I think you could make a really compelling argument that firearms, if you have more of them, there's going to be more violent crime. Now, I'm not. If someone wants to commit a violent crime, right? Nothing is going to stop them. That's kind of almost a fact, right? If someone wants to rob like a grocery store, right?
Yeah.
They can get their gang of thugs to go in and rob that grocery store. But the thing is, the firearm just makes it so much easier. So that idea, right? Like how many people? Let's go back to the idea of robbing the grocery store, right? Let's say a gang wants to do that, right? If you want to do it without firearms, right? you need like 5 or 6 people with knives and bats, right?
Yep.
If you want to do it with the firearm, maybe 2 or 3 people. So it lowers the amount of people you need. So, because you need less people, I think how many times it happens, basically, the rate of it occurring, right, would go up. So do you think that if we're on the topic of violent crime, do you want to go back to Chicago for a second?
Yeah.
Just like talk about that?
Yeah.
So do you think that Chicago, let's solve Chicago, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to have gun control, like a safe zone within Chicago, basically was already being implemented? Do you want to have, like, Illinois having like state level controls, or how would you try to fix Chicago?
I feel like the situation Chicago is right now at this point is pretty much irreversible. But like it appears that way because the government, both at the local and state level, as well as the federal level at that point, if it gets to that point, the military, they haven't been doing as much as they should in order to preserve.
Oh, yeah.
Like some parts of Chicago, especially the South Side, where there's a lot of I think which accounts for the most violent crime in Chicago, and just implementing like a safe zone there, I feel like is not going to be not going to prevent the forces of the black market, especially when it comes to guns, because they're still going to be able to have a stronghold of communities that still have a high demand for guns, not just to protect themselves, but because the presence of gangs, especially in the South Side Chicago, is so prevalent. It's so prevalent there that they need guns for families of gang leaders to just protect themselves from other gang leaders. That culture is what is like fueling gun sales at that point, especially from the black market, because the rules there are so stringent. You have to fix that first. You have to control the black market as much as possible. You have to control where the guns are coming from, especially external states and countries that are fueling that.
It goes right back to your idea of, there's that economic want for guns. So there's going to be, if there's a demand for guns, there's going to be a supply of guns, right? At the same time, if you want, obviously for criminals, right, they're always going to want guns. But what we should really be focusing on is the general public. And so that goes back to the idea that Americans just love their firearms. So do you think there's any way socially, right, that we can say, if you have a gun for self-defense, fine, whatever, right? You do you. If you want to protect yourselves, if you're in a rough area, you can have a gun. But at the same time, do you think there's any way to like reduce how obsessed Americans are with firearms?
I don't think, well, socially it's going to obviously take a lot of time because changing a mindset definitely takes a lot of time. But I think how you can catalyze that process is through human ingenuity. And I think the best way to do that is incentivize people to have things like trigger locks, automated kind of alarms in order to signal to them that their trigger locks are either not on, their firearm is vulnerable to being shot if someone is in possession of it. Like things that people who even own guns can be negligent about. People definitely make mistakes even in the most serious of circumstances when they own guns. So you have to incentivize people to have these things. There can be regulations regarding trigger locks, regarding automated alarm systems on your guns. I feel like that will start changing the mindset regarding safety and gun usage, and also makes it a lot harder for people who are not of the correct mental state from possessing a gun and from killing tons and tons of innocent people, like we've seen yesterday in Parkland, Florida.
So this is just something that came up with the top of my head right now, right? Spontaneous, okay? So if it's a dumb idea, call it what it is. Call it a dumb idea. But to help reduce how obsessed Americans are with guns, do you think it would be a good idea, and obviously this might be dumb, to have, like, force people, right, for every 2 long arms, right? So that's like a bolt-action rifle for every assault rifle. Basically, for any gun exceeding a certain length, right?
Yeah.
You have to buy a gun safe.
A gun safe?
A gun, or a gun locker. Whatever you would call it.
That's not bad. That's actually not a bad idea.
It does 2 things.
The thing is, Americans hate to be forced to do things, but I actually really like that idea because it also stimulates the economy when it comes to gun sales, because also gun salesmen can sell that, like the lockers, like you're talking about, the safes.
I'm assuming the demand would stay the same.
Yeah.
But, like, in the short run, but in the long run, I feel like there'd be such a stigma around it. People just wouldn't want to do that anymore. And obviously, the gun companies are going to be happy because they can sell more stuff.
Yeah.
And, the federal government's happy because it's showing people, like, these are dangerous. Having that gun safe, right, it screams to you that this is dangerous. So, I mean, that's just one possibility. Do you think there's any other possibility for how, gun sales in the United States could be reduced or how to change the culture or anything? I mean, it's a tough subject, so
it's extremely tough. Yeah, it can't be solved overnight, definitely. Especially not after, all these events, all these tragic events of innocent people dying as a result of gun violence have been occurring in the United States over the past few years. So overall, I just think from what I said before, human ingenuity. Human ingenuity is the only thing that can solve this.
In terms of like final thoughts for me, I think the only way that we're really going to be able to change gun sales or like gun violence in the United States is to change the culture. And because I don't really see that happening on a large scale unless federal regulations or federal laws are going to be implemented. I don't really think it's going to happen. Even if you had those federal laws, if you had those federal regulations, what would happen is that people would still get pissed. But yeah, that's all I have to say. Sean, what about you?
Same. Exactly what you said from a law perspective. I don't think that a lot can be done at this point in time. But in terms of human ingenuity, like I said, people can start thinking of more ways to, lawmakers can start thinking of more ways to prevent people who shouldn't have guns from possessing guns. And with that, we're going to wrap up today's episode. It was regarding gun violence, and we look forward to filming our next podcast, I believe, in the next week or two.
Yeah, hopefully definitely within the next week or two. So yeah, see you guys. This has been Real Talk with Shan and Bilal.
Peace.